and welcome to First Look, a Bible study looking ahead to the reading or readings for the coming Sunday. My name's Carl and it's great to have you with us today. We're going to be thinking about a difficult passage, not exactly a family-friendly reading, in that we're looking at the story of the death of John the Baptist. But before we get to that, if you haven't done so already, you may find it useful to download the sheet that accompanies this study, the link for which is just below the video in YouTube. On this sheet you will find the text that we're going to be looking at today, the questions that we'll ponder together later on, some other passages that you may wish to look up, and plenty of space to record your own thoughts and observations. So without further ado, let's dive into today's reading, which comes from Mark's Gospel, chapter 6, verses 14 to 29. Immediately before this reading, Jesus had been preaching and healing in his hometown of Nazareth, having stood up in the local synagogue. But he'd had a very hard time there because people were just not receptive to what he had to say. So instead, he and his disciples had gone round some of the surrounding villages and towns, and Jesus had, we learn in verses 1 to 13 of this chapter, sent out his disciples in pairs to cast out demons and to heal and to call people to repentance. The arrest of John the Baptist, who is the main focus of today's reading, had catalysed Jesus' public ministry, as we learn in chapter 1, verse 14 of Mark's Gospel. That was after Jesus had been baptised in the River Jordan by his older cousin, received the Holy Spirit and been thrust out into the wilderness to be tested. That's verses 4 to 13 of chapter 1. So Jesus and his cousin were intimately intertwined. And John the Baptist had begun a movement in his own right. He had his own disciples. And some scholars have argued that Jesus was one of John's proteges, essentially, and that was where he kind of learnt his trade, if you will, before he began his own public ministry. People were puzzled about who John the Baptist was, and some of this puzzlement would kind of be projected on to Jesus, as we find in today's reading. So some who were trying to make sense of the amazing things that Jesus was saying and doing thought that he might be Elijah, returned from heaven. Elijah was the greatest of the Hebrew prophets, but as we learn in 2 Kings chapter 2 verses 1 to 15, Elijah didn't actually die but was taken up to heaven in a fiery chariot. And there was an expectation that he would return when the Messiah was to come, when the day of the Lord, that great and terrible day that we hear about in Malachi 4 verse 5, was coming. So some thought that's who this Jesus must be. Others thought he must be a prophet in the style of the great Hebrew prophets, but not necessarily a specific person. But Herod, who is in many ways the focus of today's reading, had a different idea. He believed that Jesus was John the Baptist resurrected. Now, there are several Herods that appear in the New Testament, and it can get a little bit confusing. So Herod the Great was the Herod that was in charge when Jesus was a small child. The Herod who'd ordered, as we find out in Matthew's Gospel chapter 2, verses 13 to 22, the massacre of the innocents, slaughtering all boys in the region of Bethlehem aged under 2. That Herod had had 3 sons, and the Herod in today's reading was one of them. He was a puppet ruler, he was a tetrarch of the Romans, so he derived his power, in other words, from the Roman Empire. And he had responsibility for the Galilee and Pera regions from 4 BCE right through to 39 of the Common Era, so 43 years roughly of rule. But he wasn't the only ruler, puppet ruler in that region. The region of Judea and Samaria was basically looked after by Pontius Pilate, and there was another brother who'd ended up being in charge of the remainder of what had been Herod the Great's territory. So I say it does get a little bit complicated, but the key thing about this Herod that we're looking at is, I guess, that sense of insecurity and needing to keep pleasing those who kept him in power, particularly his Roman paymasters. Mark's Gospel was written around 65 to 70 of the Common Era, so therefore about sort of 30 to 40 years after these events actually happened. And it was in a phase where the community that Mark's Gospel was being written for was enduring persecution at the hands of the Roman Empire. And so I think maybe there's something there about the power of prophetic mission and continuing to speak truth to power that perhaps was there to encourage the readers of Mark's Gospel as much as it would have made the cost of what they were called to do abundantly clear. And what we're looking at here is primarily a retrospective account of the death of John the Baptist. And it's interesting that it's the only account we have of any incident in Mark's Gospel that isn't primarily about Jesus. Now, if we want to fully understand the challenge that John the Baptist had posed to Herod, we need to go right the way back into the Hebrew Scriptures to Leviticus chapter 18 verse 16 and then chapter 20 verse 21. In that, it explains that it's not legal under Jewish law for someone to marry their brother's wife. If they do that, it says, in that very patriarchal mindset, that effectively it's like lusting after your own brother. And that was what Herod had fallen foul of, because Herodias, his wife by this time, had been his brother Philip's wife. So delving into the passage then, we find in verse 14 that in a culture where news was predominantly shared orally by word of mouth, rumours swirling around who Jesus is and how he was capable of doing all these amazing things he was doing had reached the ears of this Herod. And along with some of the crowd, he wasn't entirely alone in his suppositions, he had linked Jesus with John the Baptist, with his talk of resurrection going back to the story of Elijah and Elisha that we have in 2 Kings chapter 2, verses 1 to 15. Now, at face value, it might seem rather odd that a connection is drawn between John the Baptist and miracles, because we don't have any miraculous acts of John's, if he did any, recorded. But I think what's going on here is more that Herod, who probably was feeling guilty about what he'd done to John the Baptist, was baffled by Jesus. And so, as we see in verses 14 and 16, was kind of scratching around for any explanation he could latch onto that might make sense. There was other popular speculation, as I've already mentioned, about who Jesus was. Was he Elijah, or was he an old-style Hebrew prophet? But the focus here is on Herod's thoughts and the account that we have in verses 17 to 29 of the death of John the Baptist, which reads very much like a martyrdom account of the type that we might find, for example, in 2 Chronicles chapter 24, verses 20 to 22. Though unlike some of the stories of the early Christian martyrs that we read about in the book of Acts, for example, there's no great speech that's recorded as something John said when he met his end. So it's a rather different kind of account in that sense. Now, it's likely that John was held at a military fort just east of the Dead Sea, but moved to Tiberias for this banquet. We don't know for certain that the banquet was held there, but it would make sense with what we know of Herod's various palaces and so on, plus the fact that some of the attendees were Galileans themselves, as we learn in verse 21. Now, John's calling out of Herod's breach of Torah by marrying Herodias, Philip's wife, hindered Herod's hopes of being accepted fully by the Jewish people. This was also the Herod who was spending a lot of money rebuilding the Jerusalem temple on a vast scale. I think was desperate to be accepted. And by basically saying, well, you're not following the Jewish law, John was undermining that. And Herodias had really developed a grudge against him, as we learn in verses 18 to 19. The only other mention in the whole of the New Testament we have of anybody having a grudge against anybody comes in Luke chapter 11, verse 53, in relation to the Pharisees and their feelings about Jesus. So this is a really strong thing for the New Testament authors to be saying. Herod, it seems, was at a loss, the Greek aporio, about what to do with John the Baptist, what to make of him in the first place, indeed. He was both fearful of John and intrigued by him. And it's interesting that this same word, aporio, was used when Jesus announces in John chapter 13, verse 22, that he's going to be betrayed, and says kind of, now what shall I do? Am I going to turn away from this path? No. Events came to a head, and Herod was forced to stop shilly-shallying with the question about what to do with John the Baptist, when he'd given a celebratory birthday banquet, as we hear about in verse 21. Herodias' daughter, who from what we know was in her mid-teens and thus of marriageable age in the understanding of that time, was dancing for the guests. And the term that's used when it talks about people being pleased could well be translated as having being aroused, having an erotic dimension, such as we find, for example, in Genesis 19, verse 8. And in of itself, and in the very likely alcohol-fueled atmosphere of that party, that was quite scandalous enough. Herod, her stepdad, enjoyed this dance, and he kind of responds with this extravagant oath that he makes to its stepdaughter, which might recall Numbers 30, chapter 2, and Judges 11, verses 29 to 40, about the binding nature of that kind of an oath. And he basically says, I'll give you anything you want, up to the value of half my kingdom. And the daughter goes away and consults her mother and says, well, what should I ask for? And she says, as we learn in verses 24 and 25, give me the head of John the Baptist on a platter. Herod was therefore put in a very difficult position. He'd invited some of the most powerful political and military figures in the area that he had control over to come and celebrate with him, and he desperately didn't want to lose face in front of them. But on the other hand, we've already heard in the earlier part of this passage that he regarded John as a holy and righteous man. So it seems that Herod had a real dilemma there. But quite quickly, we see with Mark's use of immediately, once again, Herod made his decision. He was going to put saving face first. He was going to put self-interest first. And so immediately he dispatched one of his bodyguards, speculatora in the Latin, to behead John the Baptist, as we learn in verse 27, and to give the head to the daughter, who we learn in verse 28 passes it on to the mother. We might draw a comparison with 1 Kings chapter 21 and the story of Queen Jezebel, who was after the prophet Elijah but didn't get the outcome she wanted, whereas Herodias did in relation to John the Baptist. And in a final verse of our reading for today, we learn that John's disciples come and they take away the body and give it a proper burial, in a move that's echoed in chapter 15, verses 42 to 46, with the burial of Jesus in a tomb. And I think both of those are significant because both were killed effectively as political prisoners and wouldn't normally have been given that kind of honour, but their disciples make sure that they were properly buried. If we fast forward a bit to chapter 9, verses 12 and 13, we find that the lesson of John's unjust death at the hands of Herod was not lost on Jesus. And while, as I say, Herod is portrayed as conflicted, he puts self-interest over John's moral challenge to him. And for us as readers today, it brings home something of the challenge that comes with speaking truth to power. If we have any illusions about how costly that is, this passage well and truly shatters them. So family-friendly it is not, but a fascinating and important text. I hope you can see from what I've outlined here, it very definitely is.